through the introduction. So let's begin by looking at the reality of self-righteousness amongst the Jews. Well, so what was the problem of the Jews? They neglected the weightier matters of the law through their own self-righteousness. Call your attention over to Matthew chapter 23. And we'll actually be looking at verses 23, 24, and 25, but let's begin by looking at verse 23. There we see Christ says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone." So, they would painstakingly go through everything. They would divide up all their mint and anise, making sure that they were tithing the way that the law would have. And of course, that's the easy part, is it not? But the heavier things, the things that would bring that causes one to I won't say judge, but use one's mind, perhaps take a different view on things such as justice, mercy, and faith, they floundered at. In relation to others, they had they really had no mercy, and there was not much of a sense of judgment. And in a relationship with God, they lacked faith in God. They had more faith in themselves than what they had that in God, and thus establishing their own self-righteousness. They would strain. Verse 24 tells us that they were blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. The idea that they would gag on the smallest of beasts, but when it came to swallowing something huge, they had no problem doing it. And then verse 25, we see, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrite! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of extortion and self-indulgence." And so on the outside, they looked holy. They looked like that they were the most religious of people that there was of their day. But on the inside, they were rancid. Uh, they were full of corruption. They stole from the widows. It was all about them. They were very, very corrupt individuals, if you will. The Arabians have a similar proverb that says, "He who eats an elephant and is sophisticated, suffocated with a gnat, or he eats an elephant and is suffocated by a gnat, or he is troubled with little things, but pays no attention to the greater things." And of course, that's what Christ was rebuking them for, that they didn't adhere to the weightier things of the law, and that they were cleansed on the outside, but leaving the inside uh, full of corruption. By extortion, meaning that they would take by force that was not rightly theirs, and then self-indulgence, basically meaning uh, unrighteousness, as the ASV points out, or a sinful nature. So that was the problem behind, and why Christ was constantly rebuking them for the way that they were. Now let's look at what was the attitude. As with all things, it's a lot of things are perpetuated, or what God looks at is the attitude behind them. And the Pharisees, again, trusted in himself that he was righteous, not that he looked to God to say that, I'm following the righteousness of God, or that the righteousness of God is shining off of him. Remember, we talked about reflecting off. But no, the Pharisee, instead, he looked at himself as a source of the light, and that he was shining. He established his own righteousness and did not trust in totally in God. And that the Pharisees, because he trusted in himself and his own righteousness, ended up despising others that he did not view as being equivalent to him. Uh, recall, over in Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 9, it says, "And he spoke a parable to them who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others." We read this parable this morning, but we'll read it once again to remind ourselves. It says, "Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and prayed thus to himself, God, I think that I'm not like that other man, an extortioner, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, I'm a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So again, it was all about attitude. The Pharisees, again, established his own righteousness, was singing praises about the things that he was doing, and was comparing himself to everybody else, saying, well, if this guy's doing this and I'm not doing that, then that makes me a great individual. But that's not necessarily the case, is it? The Pharisees, because he trusted in himself and his own righteousness, I like to say, despised others. He despised the extortioners, the unjust, instead of praying for them and hoping that they would change in their ways, or praying for them that they might receive forgiveness, or praying for them that they might have a repent or change of heart. He was beating his own, it doesn't say he was beating his chest, but he was, singing his own praises, saying, I'm not like this. I'm not like that. And because of that, he despised those other people. The Pharisee was thankful that he was not like others, and that he measured himself in his own standard by being good and righteous, while in reality he was miserably in sin. And so they that thought that they were better than attitude behind self-righteousness. Now let's look at what the result or the outcome of self-righteousness is. And I would call your attention that the first one is a lack of a lack of justice. The accusers did not bring the man. They lacked mercy. The accuser made a spectacle of a woman. And I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's look over to John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. And we begin reading over there, and it says, Now early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery. It is in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him that he might have some, that he, that he might have something to which to accuse them. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued to ask him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground again. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw that no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No, no one, Lord. And Jesus said to him, Neither do I. Go and sin no more. So we see here from the righteousness from this account that there was a lack of justice. Again, the accusers did not bring the man. Also, it takes two to commit adultery. One individual cannot can commit adultery by themselves. Two are guilty of adultery. They only brought the woman. They only wanted the woman to be stoned. There was also a lack of mercy in this instance. The accusers made a spectacle of a woman while mentioning nothing of the man. And then the accusers did not care who they hurt in the process. Ultimately, they was only concerned about tripping up Jesus and trying to make a spectacle of Jesus himself. And they didn't care about the woman. They didn't care about the others that they would have whooped up into a frenzy to kill her. Uh, they were blinded by their objective. And so again, that they lack justice. Self-righteousness lacks justice. It lacks mercy. And it doesn't care who that it hurts in the process. The accusers magnified others' sins, but failed to see their own sin. And thus, when Christ said, who was without sin, let him cast the first stone. None were without sin. So they all went away, obviously bitterly. The accusers used the sin of others to make themselves feel cleaner or bigger, if you will. Thus, self-righteousness. I have not sinned as greatly as you did, so therefore I am greater than you, or I am more holy than you. Never mind, where in the Bible does God put a degree on sin? Where does God say that one sin is greater than another sin? We're taught, or we're told in the scriptures, sin is sin. All sin separates man from God. So it doesn't matter if it's a little white lie or if it's murder. It's all sin. And so, but to the Pharisees, or when one is self-righteous, that goes completely out the door. That you become blinded to the fact that you yourself are a sinner as well, and therefore you should have no mercy on those who are in the process of committing other sins. And that's not where God would have us to be. That's not where God is with us, is He not? God forgives us of our sin when we repent. So why wouldn't we forgive others of their sin? I kind of talked about that a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the example of the guy who had committed or who was convicted of child sex offenses, and how others in the church didn't want anything to do with him, and actually was I won't say conspiring, but was not very welcoming to that individual out of their own fears. And I would argue that was perhaps maybe a degree of self-righteousness. They didn't stop to think that they were sinners and that they had been forgiven. Why weren't they forgiving towards this individual? And so forth and so forth. So it's a rather a short lesson tonight. And it's just, again, to build on that idea of shining that we talked about this morning, or self-righteousness. And the Pharisees were so much an example of that self-righteousness. And Christ, through his teaching, was always condemning the self-righteous attitude of the Pharisees. And so we too should need to be on guard that we are not self-righteous individuals, that we are not committing the same acts that they did. While we may not be doing the exact same things, but we can be following their example if we're not careful. So in conclusion tonight, we studied that what the reality of self-righteousness was amongst the Jews, what the attitude behind self-righteousness is, and then we talked about the results of self-righteousness. The proverb writer wrote over in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 12 and 13, says, "There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes," thus being self-righteous, "yet is not washed from its filthiness. There is a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are not lifted up." And so that speaks to self-righteousness. We need to ensure that we are not being self-righteous in our own right. So that's the lesson.